Depending which time zone you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Andre, my surname is Roux. I'm from the Stellenbosch University Business School all the way down south in South Africa, and it's near a city called Cape Town. Where I lecture in economics and also dabble in something called future studies. It is my privilege to speak to you this afternoon or this morning or this evening. I've been involved with the EMBA Consortium for many years. Obviously this time round is a bit different, all being remote, so again hello to everyone out there in cyberspace. And my topic this morning or this evening or this afternoon is, and I'm about to share screen and utter those eternal words, can you see my screen? So Rushan or anybody of you just like to shout out a yay or a nay?
Yay.
Then right, so there you can see it. My topic is post-pandemic economic implications for Sub-Saharan Africa. I obviously don't need to say much about the pandemic. The nature of the pandemic is well known to all of us. But I would like to kick off by just saying a bit more about Africa. And maybe the best way of doing that is to share with you some myths that many people might have about Africa and to try to dispel those myths. So many people think Africa is only one language. Entirely untrue. There are dozens, if not hundreds, even thousands of languages. I must say I have found myself in positions overseas where people have asked me to speak a bit of African. No such thing. People think Africa is technological backwards. Not entirely. Africa, for instance, has taken the lead in something called mobile money. And then people think wild animals roam everywhere and lions walk the streets. I've yet to come across that. Africans share a homogeneous culture by no stretch of the imagination. Everyone lives in a hut. Certainly not. The continent is just one big desert and it's always hot. No. Some parts are desert, and there are certainly places where it does snow. Africa's one nation, one country. No, it's 55 different countries. In fact, there are many Africas. There's no such thing as a typical African country. Just to give you an example, it is a gigantic continent. You can fit many other subcontinents or even countries into Africa. It's hugely diverse with regard to vegetation, ranging from desert land to forest land and semi-desert. It's hugely diverse in terms of climate, including obviously desert-like climates as well as tropical as well as Mediterranean. And religion, two major religions, Christianity and Islam. So clearly, just to stress the point, there's no such thing as one Africa. As I start applying these thoughts to COVID-19, I thought you might find this interesting. These figures are as of yesterday, the 13th of September, and what's indicated here are the number of cases per 100,000 members of the population. And if we zoom in on Africa, you note that most countries are shaded light yellow, which implies less than 20 cases per 100,000 people. And it really is an interesting question being raised about Africa regarding why the incidence seems to be so low. And the possible reasons, and we don't really know yet, we're still looking at this. Maybe it's simply because the epidemic or the pandemic is progressing at a slower pace in Africa. It could be, and this is something many people are talking about, that Africa has an extremely young population, and we think that younger people are less likely to either contract the virus and or become seriously ill. Half of the continent's population is younger than 20, 600 million people younger than 20. It could be, perhaps more cynically, simply a lack of testing and or a lack of reliable data. It could be, and again, obviously this has to be tested, it could be that many people in Africa have some kind of inherent immunity against viruses of this nature, because in a very strange, perverse sense of the word, we are used to viruses in this country, in this continent, used to all kinds of strange diseases. And it could be, and we hope this is the right answer, because of effective, timeless interventions by various governments. So at face value, at quick glance, it appears as if Africa might be less problematic. However, these kind of statements conceal a great deal. If we have a look at the latest economic growth projections for various parts of the world and various countries and regions, you will note that globally, expected growth this year -3%. In the USA, almost -6%, Europe -7.5%. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the bottom right-hand side, only, and I say that carefully, -1.6%. So it looks as if the effect on Africa in terms of economic growth might be less pronounced than in many other parts of the world. That said, that -1.6% will record the first negative growth rate in Sub-Saharan Africa in more than 3 decades. And of course, given the fact that a large part, we think, of Africa's economy is informal and therefore not officially measured, we suspect that the effect on the informal economy might be more pronounced than the official figures are telling us. It's also going to present challenging circumstances for businesses, for corporations, with consumers at the best of times often living close to poverty, and now in these more trying times suffering a decline in income. The demand for goods and services might very well decline. And given all kinds of constraints and realities, the chances are that the policy tools and resources that we need to deal with the situation are either very minimal and or severely constrained and or simply non-existent. So although the figures suggest, both in terms of the incidence of the virus and the economic impact, that the impact might be less pronounced in any other parts of the world, in actual fact, it is clearly making a heavy, its presence heavily felt in many parts of Africa. If we have a look again at fairly recent figures, day before yesterday, too much detail here, but for interest's sake it does give us all the countries in Africa and the total number of officially recorded cases. Then we find that one country sticks out like the proverbial sore thumb, and that is South Africa. In fact, I did a quick calculation to show that the number of cases in South Africa represent 58% of the total for Sub-Saharan Africa, and the number of deaths recorded in South Africa represent close to 2/3 of all recorded deaths. So clearly, going by official figures, South Africa is bearing the brunt of the virus, at least up to now. And therefore, in my very limited time, I'm going to zoom in and focus primarily on the South African case, as a kind of a case study, if you like, regarding coronavirus. So, there you have a map of South Africa, just a few stylized facts about the country, a population of round about 59 million, living in 9 different provinces. Right now I'm speaking from the Western Cape province, a city called Cape Town. We have 11 official languages, a world record. And what few people realize is that out of 218 countries, South Africa boasts the 29th largest economy. So bigger than most actually, although obviously very small compared to the really big movers and shakers. Something else that people don't always realize is that by far the biggest part of this country's economy is derived from the services sector, not least of which financial services, tourism, health services, education, and the like. And then naturally, like many countries in Africa, we have a very interesting and sometimes troubled history. A very important date for this country was some 26 years ago, 27th of April, when for the first time ever, every single person of voting age was allowed to vote. Prior to that, only those members of the so-called white population were allowed to vote. So what I want to do from here onwards is have a look at the condition of this country's economy prior to the virus, then a few quick facts about the virus itself in South Africa, and from that a few, if you like, economic scenarios regarding how the future, the short-term future may unfold in the light of COVID-19. So, once upon a time, as they say in the fairy tales, once upon a time, not too far back in February, as recently as February, feels like a different era, feels like a different reality. But I want to take you very quickly through the state of this country's economy not too long ago, prior to COVID-19 becoming an issue. Because it's important to know that even before the onset of this virus, this country was, economically speaking, in a spot of bother. By then, there had been 3 successive quarterly declines in the gross domestic product, so we were already in a recession. The unemployment rate of 30%, it wasn't a sudden jump to 30%, our unemployment rate has been at that kind of level or just below that for the last 20 years. Our exchange rate has the dubious distinction of being probably the most volatile, at least certainly during the first 20 years of this century. The 3 major credit rating agencies had awarded this country junk bond status. Meanwhile, levels of household debt were historically high, and the savings effort and the investment effort disturbingly low. Current account deficit has been a reality for the last 20 years. And then a very, I wouldn't say special case, but something that's really being problematic for this country is something called load shedding, which means that it doesn't happen every day, but from time to time on a daily basis, different towns, different suburbs, different cities might be without electricity for 2 hours, sometimes 4 hours, sometimes in desperate times even 8 hours. Poverty is still a reality in South Africa, as is very severe inequality, as my 2 photographs on the right hand side are showing you. 2 totally different faces of South Africa. Policy, both political and economic policy, remained uncertain. Our education system was not doing a good job, and the costs of labor were actually very high given the low productivity. So back in February 2020, the economy was not in a good place. Little did we know that far more desperate things were to lie ahead. Coronavirus or Corona-19, COVID-19. What do we think we know about this virus? Well, I think it's common knowledge anywhere in the world. There's currently no vaccine or cure. It's highly infectious. And in South Africa, we know that many dimensions of the health sector have been underperforming for a long, long time, if not forever. I don't want to bore you with too many facts and figures, but South Africa is classified as an upper middle income economy. Now, in this little table, you will note that life expectancy at birth in middle income economies is 76. Here, it is substantially lower. A bit further down, in upper middle income economies, there are 2 physicians for every 1,000 people. Here, less than 1. So we entered this crisis with what seems to be an underperforming, suboptimal healthcare sector. And we also entered the crisis with the reality that millions of South Africans are in vulnerable employment and or no employment, if they're lucky earning very low wages and often living from hand to mouth. Now, from these few thoughts and the one I'm about to share with you on the next slide, I want to come up with a set of scenarios. Before I do that, I think we're all aware of a very important indicator, if you like, regarding this virus, the so-called reproduction rate, which is very simply the average number of people an infected person can expect to pass the virus on to. And simple math shows us if that rate is greater than 1, then the disease will grow exponentially. If the rate is lower than 1, the disease grows more slowly and will eventually start fading out. And very important is this little statement, that in order to lower the reproduction rate, well, that is a function of detecting the virus, testing for it, isolating cases, treating every case and tracing every contact. I'm going to use the abbreviation DTITT for the next few minutes. DTITT, which in a very real sense is the effectiveness of the health sector response. So in typical scenario tradition, I'll be using that DTITT as one of the axes. And this can range, or could feasibly range, from being exclusive, just to a few privileged people and largely ineffective, towards being inclusive and fairly effective. So that will be the one, that is the one, if you like, determinant of the overall economic outcome. The other one has to do with the degree of, the size of, and the effectiveness of some kind of special economic stimulus package, probably engineered by, orchestrated by the government of the day. These are, after all, desperate times. They call for desperate, unusual measures. Now, that economic stimulus could range from being rather tepid and uninspired to being far more aggressive, somewhat unorthodox, even audacious. And roughly speaking, we could say that an economic stimulus of less than 5% of GDP will probably be rather inefficient, ineffective, whereas a more meaningful stimulus ranging from 15 to 20% of GDP will probably have a far more effective outcome on the economic outlook for a particular country. So now we simply put the two together and we come up with, hopefully, a set of fairly plausible scenarios. Now, for South Africa, I must hasten to add that even the best possible outcome, which is now currently depicted in front of you, that is where you have a fairly effective healthcare response along with a fairly meaningful economic response. That gives us the best possible outcome. But even that one means that there'll be a sharp downturn, but a sharp recovery, but even so, it only brings us back to where we were before the epidemic. And as I pointed out to you 10 minutes ago, before the epidemic for South Africa was a recession. So the best case outcome, unfortunately, for South Africa is back to where we were, back to square one, as I've called this scenario. If we have a situation where the healthcare response is fairly ineffective, but there is at least some kind of fairly meaningful economic stimulus, then I'm calling that yay, but oops, because it might flatter to deceive. We might get signs of a sharp recovery, but then that will be short-lived, and we'll get another recession, a so-called double-dip recession. The combination of a fairly effective healthcare response, but an uninspiring economic impact, would give us what I've called this sucks. So the GDP shrinks for a number of quarters and only slowly returns to the kind of growth we saw before the downturn, which in any case wasn't all that exciting. And the final scenario is an ineffective healthcare response, uninspiring economic stimulus that would end up being a true blue depression, a fully blown depression, a deep recession taking many years to recover to where it was before the onset of this virus. So, the $64,000 question, that never takes inflation into account, is where are we heading? Now, by rights, it's not quite correct as a scenario practitioner to put all your eggs in one basket. But let's have a look at the evidence we might have already at our disposal. Before I do that, it's also interesting, economists like describing these kind of economic recoveries by using letters of the alphabet. So back to square one is a V-shaped recovery, a sharp decline and an equally sharp recovery. Moving towards the left-hand side, yay, oops, a W-shaped recovery. A sharp decline, sharp recovery, and yet another sharp decline. This sucks is a U-shaped recovery, a sharp decline, and then for quite some time the economy muddles along doing absolutely nothing before it eventually starts improving. And then bottom left, this really sucks. That's an L-shaped sort of recovery or lack of recovery, a sharp decline, and then for a long time the economy moves sideways. So which one do I think we're heading for? Well, what's the evidence so far? If we look at measures of business confidence at a 50-60 year low, not surprising. If we have a look at economic growth estimates by our own national treasury, then you will see, looking at the pink bars, that growth for this year estimated to be in the vicinity of -7%. Next year, and the year after that, and the one after that, some modest positive growth rates. But that can be deceptive. The black line shows us the actual value of the GDP, the gross domestic product, which I've simply indexed to be 100 in 2019. Then it declines obviously significantly, recovers ever so slightly, and as this is showing us, only by 2023 does the GDP reach the level we had in 2019. A few days ago, we were told that the second quarter growth rate annualized is -51%. A bit deceptive, by the way. That is the calculation you get by looking at the second quarter growth compared to the first quarter and assuming that that will repeat itself 4 times, which is very unlikely. In fact, one might even see in the third quarter a jump, a fairly significant increase in the GDP. So I am more interested in this kind of rate than the pink line for the year round about -7. There's evidence, not yet proven, that at least 2 million jobs have in the last few months been lost. Whether permanently or temporarily, we'll have to see. But remember, that's on top of an unemployment rate already at 30%. In terms of the virus itself, as of last Thursday, you see the total number of confirmed cases, 644,000, deaths just over 15,000, and recoveries 573,000, which is roughly 90%. Roughly 90% of those in South Africa so far who have been infected have actually recovered. And many have shown very few, if any, symptoms. They've been asymptomatic. So it looks as if, and there's always the possibility, of course, of a second wave as our own lockdown relaxes, as we are seeing right now in Britain, for instance. We could see the emergence of a second wave. We could see in a few months' time a new mutation of the virus. But as things stand now, I am going to be perhaps a little bit, let me say, unusual. I'm not sure if everyone would share in my thoughts here, but I would argue that in terms of the healthcare response, through either luck and good judgment or a combination of the both, we've actually done quite well so far in terms of treating it. Unfortunately, the economic stimulus thus far has been far less impressive. There was a point about 3 months ago when the President announced a stimulus package of 500 billion rand, R500 billion, which for us is a lot of money. It transpires, however, that a big part of that is really just a rejiggling, a reshuffling of the already budgeted figures back in February of this year, and very little is actually new, additional inputs into the economy. So my judgment at this stage, and things could change overnight, is that this country is possibly looking towards a U-shaped recovery. So declines in quarterly growth figures, and then leveling off at a fairly low level of activity for quite some time, and only really picking up meaningful pace towards the end of next year, that's 2021, or early into 2022. As I showed you a bit earlier, the government's own forecast for the economy also hinting at something similar, but only in 2 or 3 years' time will the economy be back where it was back in 2019. We could also reflect or have a look at our own National Treasury's some interesting forecasts. Because we have seen a dramatic decline in tax revenue, we are looking at for this year a budget deficit, I've circled it over here, of minus 14.6%. That is huge. As you probably know, the more desired deficit is 3 to 4%. Then, partly, or not partly, exactly because of that, there's a very real risk that our government debt ratio, the ratio of debt to GDP, could actually burst through the 100% level pretty soon and end up at 140% by the end of this decade. However, our finance minister is set upon not allowing that to happen. As you can see here, he is suggesting that our government debt will peak around about 87% and then gradually decline to about 74% by the end of this decade. But to achieve that is going to require very strict fiscal policy, almost austerity-like measures, which of course are not only painful for consumers and voters, but also very often unpopular. So I suspect the truth will lie somewhere in between these two extremes. The point is we're already suffering from junk bond rating. So any meaningful and dramatic increase in this ratio will further reduce the attractiveness of South Africa as an investment destination. Our debt service cost, just paying interest on our debt, already at 22% of all tax collected. I did a very almost naughty calculation a couple of days ago, and I worked out that our budget deficit equals round about 5% of our GDP. Meanwhile, this country's agricultural sector, its contribution to the GDP is only half of that. And this country's construction sector, its contribution to GDP is about 3.8%. In fact, I even worked out that our budget deficit equals the size of the economy of Senegal and is bigger than the size of one of our neighboring countries, namely Namibia. Excuse me. So, at least in the short run, and by that I mean could even be 1 to 3 years, we are going to feel the effect of this pandemic severely, especially since we entered this lockdown period, this epidemic period, on an unfortunate note. Which sectors could possibly recover very slowly or slower than others? Well, the restaurant and takeaway sector, clothing and footwear, travel. We are still not allowed to receive international tourists or vice versa. And tourism is a big thing for South Africa. It makes up just about the same amount of economic activity as mining and agriculture added together, and employs a few million people. Toys and hobbies, media, entertainment, all the way down to electronic products. Sectors which could recover a bit quicker than the others: food, we have to eat; utilities, that's water and electricity; obviously cell phones and internet, that's become the new gold almost, or the new oil; the pharmaceutical industry. There's a possibility that people, having had the fright of their lives, might start becoming more concerned about providing for the retirement and various essential household items. We don't really know, of course. Something of this nature has never happened before, but I suppose instinct or intuition suggests what you now see on the screen. And then I'm going to start ending off, I think I've got 5 minutes left, to very quickly reflect on beyond the epidemic, beyond the pandemic, what lies ahead even further into the future for South Africa. And I would argue that there are two major drivers. I'm not saying there are not other important ones, but if we really want to be in a better place by 2030, then we need to seriously improve the nature of and the competitiveness of our skills. And secondly, we need to restore our institutions. Institutions are a key component of any successful democracy and indeed any successful economy. Over the last few years, for various reasons, the integrity and or the competence of some of our institutions has been eroded. So if we could address these these two, we end up with four scenarios. Best case, of course, would be that one. Good skills, good institutions, gold at the end of the rainbow. The worst outcome would be that one. Poor skills, poor institutions, winter of discontent. And somewhere in between we have this one. That's good skills but poor institutions. I'm calling that an Indian summer, a well-known phrase in English. When you kind of into autumn or even winter, you have one or two glorious days, but only one or two. Doesn't last very long. And then that one, poor skills but bad institutions, hope springs eternal. Now again, I'm going to be a little bit, I suppose, different to many others who might ask the same question, namely, where do I think we'll be in 2030? I suspect that, or don't suspect, I have a strong feeling that we will succeed, not overnight, it's going to take a few more years, but in improving our institutions. But even as a self-proclaimed optimist, I'd be hard-pushed to say we'll end up in terms of having the right kind of skills by 2030. You all know the saying, as a wise old man once said, if you want 12 years of education, guess what? It takes about 12 years. So I think we'll make progress along this one, but probably not into that one by 2030. So that implies that we could end up being in hope springs eternal. Not the worst place to be, not the best place either, but holding promise for further improvements. By 2040, we could make meaningful inroads into moving into the right skills quadrant. I suspect I have 2 minutes left, so I will use my 2 minutes as effectively as possible by pointing out that yes, there are many issues and problems in South Africa, and naturally this pandemic could not have come at a worse time. It really is problematic. However, and I'm skip this to save time, I'm sure there'll be copies of the slides, I would like to point out that underneath and overlapping and operating side to side with all these concerns, there are some good things to say about the society and about the economy. I've already made the point. We have an upper middle income economy, one of the 30 largest in the world, a very well respected financial infrastructure, a very diversified economy. We don't have all our eggs in one basket. Our central bank is generally doing a pretty good job in very trying circumstances. We have youth on our side. Some would say we have youth as our enemy, but if we can use our young population and educate them, etc., we could become the envy of the world. We've been resilient time and time again, and when we need to, we can be innovative. So to summarize, South Africa, like virtually any other country on this planet, will certainly find no benefit from this pandemic. We moved into the pandemic from a position of weakness as it is. For the rest of Africa, and I made the point earlier, there's no such thing as one other Africa. Different countries will experience the effects in different ways. Suffice to say, however, that most countries in Africa struggle to escape from low to medium income status. Resources tend to be confined and constrained, but who knows, maybe many African countries are so resilient because they've had no choice in the past that they might fare a little bit better than many others on this planet. If all of this has been awfully confusing and far too quick, I implore you to just keep calm and study economics, and all will become clear. And on that note, Rosanna, I think that is my 35 minutes on the dot, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to stop sharing, again, those eternal words, and call up my face, which I'm not really in outer space, by the way, it's just pretending to be. Roshana, I'm now essentially in your hands for the next couple of minutes.
Prof, there's a question. Has the minister shared how he plans to reduce the government debt ratio, or is it wishful thinking?
Well, no, he has shared. He, number one, over the next 3 years, he wants to cut back on government spending by a total of just over 300 billion rand. But in addition to that, and very controversially and politically very interesting and brave, beginning of this year, announced already that for the next year or two, civil servants' salaries will be frozen, which should also save quite a bit. So on the spending side, that's the intention. On the revenue side, there was a time, let's say 10 to 15 to 20 years ago, when our revenue collection service was doing a remarkable job. But for various reasons, I won't go into all the gory detail, there's been a loss over time of some competence and or even integrity. They want to restore that and really jack up again the tax collection side. Of course, the constraint there is always a slowly growing economy. But that's the idea. Is he even wants to introduce zero-based budgeting for departments, where they have to start afresh with a clean slate every year and motivate item by item why they want to spend a certain amount of money. And the past has kind of been, well, what did we spend last year? Let's add 5 or 6% to that. So the intention is there. Whether it is going to be politically palatable, we'll have to see. But yes, there's a plan. There's a plan, certainly.
And then what do you think the inequality index trend is going to be in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I'm afraid that, as I've already pointed out, South Africa is already very unequal. If we use the Gini coefficient as a measure for that, we are actually the most unequal society on this planet. I'm afraid that some aspects of the pandemic will probably aggravate in some ways that inequality. I think immediately of education, and just school education. So just after the lockdown was announced in late March, schools shut down for a certain period. But they did, if they could, carry on with, let's call it, various forms of remote learning. But now the reality is, remote learning requires having a computer, a laptop, or some smart device. It requires having sufficient bandwidth. So unfortunately, the more privileged members of society and their children were able to continue with their education, albeit from home. Whereas the poorer members of society, children, and I'm afraid that's the majority, did not have that possibility. So in many ways, I fear very strongly that the already existing education inequality will become more aggravated by the end of this year or sometime in the future. Anecdotal evidence is showing us that in some provinces, up to 40% of school-going children have just disappeared from the system. We don't even know where they are, in the sense that they haven't reported back at school or they've not made contact with the school. So I fear that in some ways that inequality will sadly widen even further. The other disappointing thing is that for so many years, I think economists all over the world have been saying that the name of the game in terms of job creation is increasingly self-employment, small businesses. But sadly, in the last 6 months during lockdown, it's those very businesses that have suffered most. Everyone suffered, but they have suffered most. And one only hopes that they'll be able to sort of rehabilitate themselves and get back onto the radar screen. So I'm afraid to answer your question, I suspect that already existing inequalities might in some ways become exacerbated.
And then another one, some say this is going to be an African century. Do you think that there's any truth in it? If so, how well placed is South Africa to take advantage of this? Do you think that there's any other country who could get ahead of SA in Africa?
Okay, it's actually two questions there. This Africa century, well, I've already admitted I am a self-proclaimed and often criticized eternal optimist. So I would like to agree with that point, but at the same time perhaps also realistically. Obviously, there are many stumbling blocks in Africa, ranging from infrastructure, education backlogs, and the like. But I also mentioned earlier we have a young population, half of our population younger than 20. Whereas those of you from Europe, for instance, or Japan, and even America will know we have quite the opposite situation. There you have aging. In Europe, there are more elderly people than there are children. Here in Africa, we have the potential of something called a demographic dividend, which means the following. That's a huge if all our young people are properly educated, properly trained, properly skilled, and therefore able to find jobs, then all kinds of good things start happening, not just for them, but for the entire economy. They earn a better income, they buy goods and services, production of goods and services increases, education gets even better, and then, because they don't have too many dependents, they can afford to start putting money aside for saving, which in turn can finance investment, which can finance further economic growth. The potential is there for the demographic dividend. I'm afraid it could go awfully wrong, however. If all those young people are not properly educated and trained, and these days we have to add the word for the fourth industrial revolution, then the story I've just painted might turn out to be totally impossible. We could get almost the opposite, social disorder. But yes, we have that potentially on our side. We won't see the success overnight, of course not. It might take a couple of decades, but if that's what it takes, so be it. We do have the well-known cliches, vast amounts of resources. Problem is, we export it in raw form to somebody else. If we can start adding value ourselves, well, again, that would be hugely beneficial. But the answer will differ from country to country, depending upon the country's ability and willingness to, put this politely, to ensure accountable governance, and probably depending on its willingness and ability to train and educate its people, as well as to diversify the economy. And it will differ from country to country. South Africa's role in this? Yes, I think it's there. I mean, this country is not the biggest in Africa, by the way, economically, only the third biggest, after Nigeria and Egypt. But in terms of many other indicators, perhaps in many ways doing exceptionally well. We must be wary not to come over as being a big brother, telling other people how to go about doing their business. But I think what we need, generally speaking, in Africa, and this is my last comment, is far greater cooperation, collaboration, integration between countries on this continent. We often tend to be our own biggest enemies, almost rivals with one another. We need something approaching the idea of European Union. Right, let me stop there.
Prof, with 2 minutes left, what is the investment prospects in Africa, especially for South Africa, from international parties such as China, look like for the next few years?
Okay, well, we have to be honest that Africa has very rarely, over the last few hundred years, been the world's most favored investment destination. But I think I'm going to answer that question by almost ironically going back to my slideshow and showing a slide I did not show initially just to save some time. So just give me 2 seconds, I'm almost there. Just when you want things to work properly. And just give me a second to find the number that I'm looking for. I think it's round about number 8, could be, no, not quite. Almost there. No, I'm going the wrong way. There we are. So I quickly want to show you the front cover of a well-known magazine called The Economist. And I'm showing this one in particular because they tend to be cynical. So as recently as the year 2000, they spoke about the hopeless continent. 13 years later, a totally different view, aspiring Africa, referring at the time to the world's fastest growing continent. Then in 2016, I remember after 2013, things slowed down a bit again all over the world, including Africa, but nonetheless, The Economist normally Afro-pessimists said, you know what, it's time to make Africa work. And I think they're using this symbolism to show you the cogs of machinery, so let's start manufacturing, but also the point I just made, countries interlinking with one another. And then very interestingly, last year, they had this to say about Africa, the new scramble for Africa. a reference to the phrase used 200 years ago with the then colonialism, where the then colonial, what should we call them, countries or colonizing countries scrambled to get hold of Africa's resources. In this newer version, The Economist says there's a new kind of scramble. They point out in the last couple of years that not only China, but many other countries in Europe and America have also started showing renewed interest in Africa. The catch is, the trick is, how Africans could also benefit from the new scramble. So it becomes a win-win situation and not a foreign country winner-takes-all kind of situation. So I think the prospects are there. Again, it depends on the country. In some countries, you might want to think carefully before investing. But as The Economist also said, especially in the 2016 version, despite all its problems, we must look at the very real possibility that the number of middle-income consumers in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is going to increase by at least 200 million by the year 2030. That is a huge market in anybody's language.
Thank you, Prof. That's the end of our session. You did brilliantly.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody out there. Enjoy the rest of the week. I've looked at the program. It is a tremendous program. Enjoy it. And Rushana, thanks very much to you. Samantha, you're also there. Hello. And to David in his absence, probably thank you. And best wishes for the days that remain ahead.
Great session.